"First class? That's got to be a mistake," she hissed, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. 8 words, dripping with venom. That's all it took. Twins, barely 16, already fighting the weary battle of being black in a white world, and this time 30,000 feet in the air. They didn't know that a phone call, fueled by a father's glacial fury, would ground this flight, maybe even this entire damn airline. You think this is just about a delayed vacation? Nah. This is about something deeper. The quiet steel in Maya's eyes when she offered Claire a small, almost imperceptible smile. She has no idea how her quiet kindness will change everything. Not a clue. Dragged off the plane in front of silent passengers and smug bystanders, they made one phone call. That call didn't just cancel a flight, it triggered career-ending fallout, media outrage, and a father's ruthless response that would leave an entire airline gasping for air. You won't believe what happened next. The air in the first-class cabin of Stellara Air Flight 723 to London was a carefully curated blend of quiet luxury and recycled oxygen. Leather seats the color of rich cream offered a stark contrast to the brilliant blue of the New York sky, visible through the wide oval windows. For 15-year-old twins Maya and Nia, it was an environment they were familiar with, yet never took for granted. They were seasoned travelers, their passports a tapestry of stamps from their father's business trips and their family's adventurous holidays. Maya, the more introspective of the two, was already lost in a novel, her long braids cascading over the supple leather of her headrest. Nia, ever the observer, was taking in the cabin's details with the discerning eye of a future architect, her sketchbook open on the polished wood grain tray table. They were dressed in what their mother called respectable comfort, tailored joggers, cashmere hoodies, and pristine sneakers. They were polite, quiet, and occupied seats, 2A and 2B. Their tranquility was first disturbed by a subtle yet unmistakable shift in the atmosphere. It arrived in the form of a flight attendant named Claire. Claire had the practiced smile and immaculate presentation of a 20-year veteran of the skies. Her blonde hair was pulled into a chignon, so tight it seemed to stretch the skin around her temples, and her uniform was flawlessly pressed. She moved through the cabin with an air of proprietary ownership, her eyes scanning over the passengers, making silent, swift assessments. Her gaze lingered on Maya and Nia. It wasn't a welcoming glance. It was a scrutinizing one, a flicker of something that was not quite confusion, but closer to suspicion. She passed them without a word, attending to the older gentleman in 1A, offering him a pre-aperture glass of champagne with a deferential smile. She then served the couple across the aisle, laughing at a remark the man made. She circled back to the twins. The practiced smile was gone, replaced by a thin, tight line. "Good morning," she said, her tone clipped. "I'll need to see your boarding passes." Nia, unfazed, looked up from her sketchbook. "Of course." She reached into the side pocket of her carry-on, the one they always used for documents, and produced 2 crisp boarding passes, handing them over. Claire took them, not with her fingertips, but with a full, firm grasp, as if they were contaminated. Her eyes darted from the names Maya Jackson, Nia Jackson, to the seat numbers, 2A, 2B, and back to the girls' faces. The silence stretched. It was a weighted silence, thick with unspoken questions. "Is there a problem?" Maya asked, finally, looking up from her book, her voice calm and level. She had felt this kind of scrutiny before. It was a familiar, unwelcome chill. Claire handed the passes back, the corner of her lip twitching into something that was not a smile. "These are first-class seats." "Yes, we know," Nia said, a hint of steel entering her voice. "That's why we're sitting in them." Another passenger, a man in a rumpled suit in the row behind them let out a short, derisive snort. He didn't bother to hide it. Nia's eyes met his for a split second, and he looked away, a smug smirk on his face. Claire ignored Nia's comment. Her eyes roamed over their comfortable attire, a stark contrast to the business suits and designer dresses around them. The judgment was palpable. "Sometimes passengers get confused," she said, her voice laced with a condescending sweetness. "The economy cabin is just down the aisle to the rear of the aircraft. I can help you find your correct seats if you'd like." It was the correct seats that did it. The implication was as clear as the window beside them. These were the incorrect people for these seats. "There's no confusion," Maya stated, closing her book with a soft but definitive thud. "These are our assigned seats. We are in the correct cabin." The flight attendant's facade of professional courtesy began to crumble, revealing a foundation of raw prejudice. "I'm going to have to ask you to move," she insisted, her voice rising slightly, drawing the attention of other passengers. "These seats are reserved for our premium flyers." "And what do you think we are?" Nia challenged, her posture straightening. She refused to be intimidated. Her father had taught them better. "Never shrink," he'd always said. "Occupy the space you're entitled to." "Look, girls," Claire said, dropping any pretense of politeness and leaning in conspiratorially, though her voice was loud enough for the surrounding rows to hear. "I don't know how you got these tickets, if you used someone else's miles, or if there's been some sort of mistake. But there's no way you're supposed to be here. This cabin is full, and I'm sure the people who are actually meant to be in these seats will be arriving shortly." The accusation hung in the air, ugly and venomous. "You don't belong. You are frauds." The other first-class passengers were now openly staring. Some had looks of mild curiosity, others of clear amusement. A woman clutching a pearl necklace whispered to her husband. No one intervened. No one offered a word of support. In their silence, they were complicit. Maya felt a familiar sting behind her eyes, the hot rush of humiliation and anger, but she pushed it down, channeling her father's composure. "I'd like to speak to your purser," she said, her voice steady. "Or the captain?" Claire let out a short, incredulous laugh. "The captain is busy with pre-flight checks, and I am the purser on this flight. You'll deal with me. Now, are you going to move on your own, or do I need to have you moved?" It was a threat, plain and simple. Maya and Nia exchanged a look. It was a look that passed between them 1,000 times a day, a silent language forged in the unique bond of twinship. This look, however, was different. It was a mixture of fear, defiance, and a shared steely resolve. They weren't going anywhere. "We're not moving," Nia said, her voice ringing with a clarity that cut through the cabin's murmur. "Because we have done nothing wrong." Claire's face hardened into a mask of cold fury. "Fine," she hissed, turning on her heel. "Have it your way." She marched toward the front of the plane, grabbing the InterSyn phone. Her back was to them, but they could see the rigid set of her shoulders, the angry, jerky movements as she spoke into the receiver. The ordeal, they knew, was far from over. It was only just beginning. The 5 minutes that followed Claire's phone call felt like an eternity. The curated calm of the first-class cabin had evaporated, replaced by a tense, expectant hush. The other passengers were no longer trying to be discreet. They were openly watching Maya and Nia, whispering behind their hands, their faces a mixture of pity, morbid curiosity, and self-righteous justification. The man in the row behind them had his phone out, angled in their direction, though he pretended to be reading an email. Maya's hands were clenched into fists in her lap, her knuckles white. She focused on her breathing, a technique her father had taught her for high-pressure board meetings. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Control what you can control. Your breath, your dignity. Naya sat ramrod straight, her gaze fixed on the back of the seat in front of her, her jaw set in a line of defiance. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. The gentle hum of the auxiliary power unit was suddenly punctuated by the heavy tread of footsteps coming up the jet bridge. 2 uniformed airport security officers appeared at the cabin door, their faces grim, their hands resting on the equipment at their belts. They were followed by Claire, who now wore an expression of vindicated authority. "Them," she said, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at the twins. "Seats 2A and 2B. They are refusing to move from seats they haven't paid for and are causing a disturbance." The accusation was a deliberate lie. They had been nothing but quiet until confronted. The only disturbance was the one Claire herself had orchestrated. One of the officers, a burly man with a thick neck and a name tag that read Donnelly, stepped into the cabin. He had the weary, impatient look of a man who dealt with trouble all day and had no time for nuance. "Ma'am, miss," he said, addressing them both. His voice was loud, official, and utterly devoid of empathy. "We've had a report that you're in the wrong seats and are refusing to cooperate with the flight crew. We need you to gather your belongings and come with us." "But these are our seats," Maya protested, her voice shaking slightly despite her best efforts. "We have our boarding passes. We can show you our confirmation emails. Our father booked these tickets." "Everyone has a story, kid," the second officer, younger and leaner, said with a cynical sigh. "We just need you to come off the plane so we can sort this out. The flight's getting delayed." He wasn't wrong. The captain's voice crackled over the PA system. "Folks, this is Captain Anderson up at the front. We're dealing with a minor boarding issue at the moment, and we appreciate your patience. We hope to have it resolved shortly and get on our way." A collective groan went through the cabin. The other passengers now saw the twins not just as interlopers, but as the direct cause of their inconvenience. The whispers grew louder, more hostile. They should just go. What's the big deal? Just move. Some people are so entitled. The irony of that last comment was a physical blow. "We are not moving," Naya said, her voice low and trembling with a rage she could no longer contain. "You are making a mistake, a very big mistake." Officer Donnie's patience snapped. "That's it. We're done talking." He gestured to his partner. "Let's go." He reached for Maya's arm. The moment his fingers wrapped around her bicep, a switch flipped. The theoretical injustice became a terrifying physical reality. She flinched, pulling back instinctively. "Don't touch my sister," Naya cried out, her voice sharp with panic. She made a move to stand between them, but the second officer immediately blocked her, his presence an intimidating wall. What happened next was a blur of shame and helplessness. Donnelly, using a firm, unyielding grip, pulled Maya out of her seat. She stumbled into the aisle, her book clattering to the floor. She wasn't fighting. She wasn't resisting. But she was being handled with the force one would use on a criminal. Her cashmere hoodie bunched up, and for a mortifying moment, she felt like a child being disciplined in front of a crowd of strangers. The younger officer then took Nia's arm, and though he was slightly less rough, the intent was the same. He propelled her into the aisle behind her sister. Naya's sketchbook fell, scattering loose drawings of buildings and bridges across the plush carpet. A charcoal sketch of the Eiffel Tower, a memory from their last trip with their dad, landed face up. They were being dragged, not kicking and screaming, but with a firm, inexorable force that brooked no argument. They were paraded down the length of the first-class cabin, past the silent, staring faces of the other passengers. Maya locked eyes with the woman with the pearl necklace. The woman looked down, suddenly fascinated by her own hands. The man who had snorted earlier watched with a look of grim satisfaction. Not a single person spoke up for them. As they passed the galley, they saw Claire. She stood with her arms crossed, watching the procession she had initiated. The look on her face was not of triumph, but of smug certainty. It was the look of someone who had confirmed her own biases, who saw this humiliating spectacle as a restoration of the natural order. They were escorted down the jet bridge, the sounds of the bustling airport growing louder. The stares continued from the gate agents, from the other passengers waiting to board, from passers-by who craned their necks to see the commotion. 2 black teenage girls being led away from a first-class cabin by security. The narrative wrote itself in the minds of the onlookers, a story of presumption, entitlement, and comeuppance, a story that was entirely poisonously wrong. When they reached the end of the jet bridge and were deposited into the sterile environment of the gate area, the officer finally released Maya's arm. A red mark was already forming on her skin. She looked at her sister, and for the first time saw tears welling in Naya's eyes. Nia, the strong one, the defiant one, looked utterly broken. The gate agent, a harried woman named Susan, looked from the officers to the girls, a frown of confusion on her face. "What's going on?" Refused to leave their seats, Donnelly grunted. "Purser says they don't belong in first." Humiliation gave way to a cold, burning anger. Maya's mind cleared. Her father's words echoed again, but this time it was a different lesson. When they won't listen to reason, you find a bigger microphone. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely unlock it. Nia saw what she was doing, and a flicker of hope cut through her despair. "What are you doing?" the younger officer asked, his tone suspicious. "I'm making a phone call," Maya said, her voice dangerously quiet. She scrolled through her contacts, past friends, past her mum, until she found the entry she was looking for. It was a simple one, but it held more power than anyone in that airport could possibly comprehend. "CEO Dad." She pressed the call button. It rang once, twice, and then his voice, calm and familiar, came through the speaker. "Maya, is everything okay, sweetie? You should be taking off soon." Maya took a shaky breath. "Dad," she said, and her voice cracked. They just dragged us off the plane." The silence on the other end of the line was infinite, decimal, a mere nancond. But within it, Marcus Jackson processed his daughter's words, the background chatter of his office in downtown Manhattan, the muted clicking of keyboards, the distant city sirens. It all faded into nothing. The world narrowed to that single cracked phrase, "They just dragged us off the plane." Marcus Jackson was not a man given to overt displays of emotion. He had built his tech empire, a multi-billion-dollar AI and logistics firm called Logic Core, on a foundation of cold, hard data and unflappable logic. He navigated hostile takeovers and market crashes with the same steady pulse. But at that moment, a glacial rage, pure and absolute, began to form in his chest. "Where are you right now, Maya?" His voice was preternaturally calm. A deliberate choice. Panic wouldn't help. Control was everything. "We're at the gate. Gate C32. There are security officers here. Dad, they hurt my arm." He heard Nia begin to sob quietly in the background. It was a sound that sliced through him. He swiveled in his ergonomic chair, his gaze fixed on the panoramic view of the city, though he saw none of it. "Put me on speaker, Maya, and hold the phone up so they can hear me." Maya did as she was told, her trembling fingers fumbling with the screen. She held the phone out towards Officer Donnelly and the gate agent, Susan. "My name is Marcus Jackson." His voice boomed from the small device, crisp and resonant, carrying an authority that was unmistakable. I am the father of the 2 young ladies you have just physically assaulted and removed from their flight. They are 15 years old. I am also the ticket holder for seats 2A and 2B on Stellara Air Flight 723. The tickets were purchased with my personal American Express Centurion card. I am a Stellara Air Platinum executive member, and my company Logic has an exclusive corporate travel contract with your airline worth approximately $50 million a year. A stunned silence fell over the gate area. Officer Donnie's smug expression faltered. Gate Agent Susan's eyes widened, her face paling. She began typing furiously into her computer terminal, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Marcus continued, his voice dropping to a dangerously low, precise tone. You have made a catastrophic error in judgment. I want the names of the flight attendant who initiated this and the security officers who laid hands on my children. Donnelly shuffled his feet, his bravado evaporating under the weight of Marcus's words. Sir, we were just following procedure. Your procedure? Marcus cut in his voice like chipping ice. Involved physically removing 2 teenage passengers who were legally and rightfully in their seats based on the prejudiced assessment of one of your employees. That's not a procedure. That's an assault. Now give me the names. Susan, looking at her screen, gasped. The information flashing back at her confirmed everything. The tickets were legitimate. The corporate account was one of the airline's largest. A cascade of red flags and high-priority alerts began to blink next to the Jackson name. She looked at the 2 girls standing there in their hoodies, looking young and scared, and then back at the impassive officers, and a dawning horror washed over her. The purser's name is Claire Sterling. She stammered, deciding in a split second that cooperation was her only path to survival. The officers, before she could finish Marcus's voice, cut through again. That's enough for now, Susan. I appreciate your assistance. Now, please listen very carefully. I am on the phone with my executive assistant, who is currently conferencing in Stellara Air's CEO, Mr. Robert Albright. I happen to have his personal cell number. While we wait for him to pick up, I want you to do something for me. I want you to get on the intercom to that aircraft. I want you to inform Captain Anderson that Flight 723 will not be going to London. Not today. It's cancelled. Susan stared at the phone as if it were a venomous snake. Sir, I can't do that. I don't have the authority. You do now, Marcus said simply. Because in about 30 seconds, your CEO is going to give you that authority. My daughters were publicly humiliated. They were treated like criminals in front of a plane full of passengers. So now the entire plane gets to share in the inconvenience. No one is going anywhere. On the other end, Marcus's assistant, a hyper-efficient woman named Zara, whispered. Mr. Albright is on the line. Sir? Marcus acknowledged her. Robert, he said, his tone shifting from a father's rage to a CEO's cold fury. Marcus Jackson, we have a problem. A $50 million a year problem, currently standing at gate C32 at JFK. He briefly, clinically outlined the situation. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. The facts laid bare were damning enough. Back at the gate, Susan's phone rang. It was the direct line from operations. She answered it with a trembling hand. She listened for a moment, her face a mask of disbelief. She muttered, Yes, sir, I understand. Right away she hung up, took a deep breath, and pressed the button for the gate-wide PA system. Her voice shook as she made the announcement. Attention passengers of Stellara Air Flight 723 to London. This flight has been cancelled. A collective gasp followed by an uproar erupted from the passengers waiting to board. Inside the plane, the announcement would have been met with stunned confusion. Susan then picked up the inter-cabin phone to the aircraft. "Captain Anderson, this is Susan at the gate. Per executive order from the CEO's office, Flight 723 is cancelled. I repeat, the flight is cancelled. All passengers must deplane." On board the aircraft, Captain Anderson, a veteran pilot who thought he'd seen everything, was dumbfounded. He stared at his first officer. Cancelled by the CEO's office? What in the hell is going on? Down in the first-class cabin, Claire Sterling, who had been preening from her victory, felt a cold dread wash over her. Cancelled. It made no sense. Then her eyes fell on the two empty seats, seats 2A and 2B, and she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that this unprecedented chaos was because of the two girls she had just forced off the plane. Maya and Naya stood watching as the first of the deplaning passengers began to trickle out of the jet bridge, their faces a thundercloud of confusion and anger. The man from the row behind them, the one who had snorted, was one of the first out. He saw the twins standing there, no longer looking like criminals, but like the calm center of a storm of their own making. His smugness was gone, replaced by a look of utter bewilderment. He opened his mouth to say something, then closed it, shaking his head as he stormed off to join the growing, chaotic crowd at the customer service desk. The call was over. Marcus had assured his daughters that a car was on its way, and that he would handle everything. Maya ended the call, her hand steady now. She looked at Naya, whose tears had dried, replaced by a look of awe. They hadn't just been hurt. They had been amplified. The humiliation they had suffered was now being broadcast back at their tormentors, magnified 100-fold. This wasn't just karma. This was a reckoning. The cancellation of a fully boarded international flight is not a small event. It is a logistical tidal wave, and Gate C-32 became its chaotic epicenter. The initial disbelief of the passengers curdled into a furious, frantic energy. Business trips were ruined, holidays evaporated, connections were missed. The terminal, once a place of orderly queues and quiet anticipation, descended into a cacophony of ringing phones, shouted complaints, and crying children. Maya and Nia were led by a shell-shocked Susan to a small private office away from the maelstrom. The two security officers, Donnelly and his partner, had vanished, likely summoned to a meeting that would be the beginning of the end of their careers. Through the glass wall of the office, the twins could see the passengers they had shared the first-class cabin with. Their privilege and composure had disintegrated. The woman with the pearl necklace was jabbing her finger at a beleaguered gate agent, her voice shrill. Her husband stood beside her, his face pus with rage, shouting into his phone about a missed merger meeting in Canary Wharf. The man who had snorted at them was frantically trying to rebook on another airline, only to be told everything was sold out. Their inconvenience, their anger, their entitlement, it was all on full display, stripped of the polite veneer of the premium cabin. They had silently watched the twins' humiliation, and now they were loudly broadcasting their own. But the focal point of the chaos was Claire Sterling. She had been forced to deplane along with everyone else. Her authority as purser rendered meaningless. As she walked through the jet bridge, she had to pass the empty seats 2A and 2B, a stark monument to her catastrophic misjudgment. When she emerged into the gate area and saw the pandemonium, the reality of what she had done began to settle in, cold and heavy as lead. She was immediately surrounded, not by superiors, not yet, but by the furious passengers from her cabin. "What the hell happened, Claire?" the man from 1A demanded, his earlier deference gone. "1 minute you're throwing 2 kids off the plane, the next we're all grounded. Are the 2 related? This is your fault." Another woman shrieked, pointing at her. "You did this!" Claire tried to retreat into her professional training to project calm and control. "Ladies and gentlemen, please." There was a security issue. A security issue, the man scoffed. The only security issue was you racially profiling 2 children. We all saw it. We heard you. This was perhaps the most stunning blow. The same people who had sat by in silent complicity were now turning on her, using her actions as the focal point for their own rage and frustration. They needed a scapegoat, and she was it. Their silence hadn't been out of agreement with her necessarily, but out of a desire to avoid involvement. Now that they were involved and deeply inconvenienced, their tune had changed entirely. Morality had become a matter of expediency. Her airline-issued phone began to ring. It was the JFK station manager. His voice was not the collegial tone she was used to. It was clipped, cold, and furious. "Sterling, my office now. And bring your union rep. You're going to need them." The line went dead. Her walk to the station manager's office was a walk of shame. Colleagues she had known for years averted their eyes. Gate agents whispered as she passed. The news was spreading through the airport's tight-knit employee community like wildfire. Claire Sterling got a 777 to London cannelled, all of it because of 2 passengers. The story was already becoming legend. Inside the station manager's office, the atmosphere was frigid. Her union representative was there, a man named Gary, who already looked exhausted. But it was the other person in the room that made her blood run cold. A stern-faced woman from Stellara's corporate legal department had been dispatched from downtown. The questioning was brutal and direct. "Miss Sterling, can you explain why you questioned the validity of the boarding passes of passengers Maya and Nia Jackson?" They didn't look like they belonged. The word sounded flimsy and prejudiced even to her own ears, stripped of the righteous authority she had felt on the plane. "What exactly does a first-class passenger look like, Miss Sterling?" the lawyer asked, her pen poised over a legal pad. Claire stammered. "Well, usually they're older, dressed for business." "So your decision was based on their age and their attire and their attitude," Claire added desperately. They were defiant. Defiant of what? Of your baseless accusation that they were thieves. She had no good answers. Every word she uttered dug her hole deeper. She spoke of procedure, of her right as purser to ensure cabin integrity. But the lawyer dismantled her arguments with surgical precision. "Did you access the passenger manifest on your tablet, Miss Sterling?" "I was about to." "But you didn't. If you had, you would have seen the platinum executive status. You would have seen the corporate travel account link. You would have seen a dozen red flags telling you to be careful. But you chose not to look. Why?" Claire couldn't answer. The truth was too ugly. She hadn't looked because she had already made up her mind the moment she saw 2 black teenagers in her pristine cabin. She had seen what she expected to see, not what was actually there. Her prejudice had blinded her to the facts. The meeting ended with her being placed on immediate unpaid suspension, pending a full investigation. She was ordered to turn in her employee ID. As she slid the plastic card across the polished table, she felt a part of her identity slide away with it. For 20 years, she had been Claire Sterling, Stellara Air Purser. It was more than a job. It was her status, her world. She built her life around the glamour of travel, the respect she commanded in the cabin, the clear, stratified order of things where people were in their proper places. As she left the office, stripped of her credentials, she had to walk back through the main terminal. The departure board was a sea of red. Cancelled, cancelled, cancelled. Flight 723 was just one casualty. The ripple effect was snarling operations across the board. The financial cost of this one event, the passenger compensation, the airport fees, the logistical nightmare would run into the millions. And then she saw them across the terminal, near a private exit. Maya and Nia were being met by a man in a sharp suit. He enveloped them in a hug, his face a mask of concern and love. He wiped a tear from Nia's cheek, his hand gentle. It was Marcus Jackson. He looked up, and his eyes, cold and sharp as diamonds, met Claire's across the crowded space. He didn't glower. He didn't gesture. He just looked at her. And in that look, Claire Sterling understood the full terrifying scope of her mistake. This wasn't just about a cancelled flight or a lost job. She hadn't just provoked a passenger. She had awakened a sleeping giant, and this, she realized with a sickening certainty, was only the beginning of her free fall. The hard karma was just getting started. The story of Flight 723 didn't stay within the confines of JFK Airport. By the time Marcus Jackson's driver was navigating the traffic out of Queens, the incident had already breached the containment walls of corporate communications and was beginning to bleed into the public consciousness. A passenger from the economy cabin, a tech blogger who had smelled a story, had live-tweeted the entire saga from his seat, from the initial delay to the stunning cancellation, and the rumored reason why. His thread, complete with grainy photos of the chaos at the gate, was going viral. #Stellar Shame and #Justice for Maya and Nia were trending before Claire Sterling had even been suspended. But Marcus Jackson wasn't interested in a trial by social media. That was messy, unpredictable. He operated in a world of contracts, leverage, and consequences. The emotional protective father who had comforted his daughters in the terminal had now fully given way to the ruthless CEO. The next morning, an emergency meeting of the Stellara Air Executive Board was convened. The atmosphere in the gleaming Manhattan boardroom was funereal. Their stock had taken a 4% pre-market trading hit based on the rumors alone. Their CEO, Robert Albright, a man whose tailored suits usually looked effortless, appeared haggarded. "He's not just pulling the logic account," Albright announced, his voice heavy. That was just the opening salvo. He laid out the demands Marcus Jackson had conveyed to him in a call at 5 a.m. that morning. It wasn't a negotiation, it was an ultimatum. First, Marcus demanded a full, public and unreserved apology. Not a vague corporate statement about not meeting customer expectations, but a detailed admission of what happened to his daughters, naming the specific prejudices at play. The apology was to be issued by Robert Albright himself. Second, he demanded the immediate termination of Claire Sterling and the 2 security officers involved. Not suspension, not retraining. Termination. Third, and this was the masterstroke, he demanded that Stellara Air partner with a foundation of his choosing, one dedicated to racial equity and education for underprivileged youth and funded with a $10 million endowment. Furthermore, he required that Stellara implement a mandatory top-to-bottom bias and de-escalation training program for all 50,000 of its employees, from baggage handlers to the board of directors. The curriculum was to be designed and approved by a third-party diversity, equity, and inclusion DEI firm, also chosen by Marcus. $10 million mandatory training for the entire company. One of the board members, a grizzled veteran of the airline industry named Harrison, balked. "That's insane. We can't let one customer dictate our corporate policy and philanthropy." "He's not just one customer, Harrison," Albright shot back, slamming his hand on the table. "He's Marcus Jackson. Do you have any idea how many other CEOs he talks to? How many boards he sits on? Logicor's logistics software is integrated into the supply chains of half the Fortune 500. He is one of the most respected and connected men in global business. This isn't about the $50 million account anymore. This is about our brand. He is framing this as a test. The world is watching to see how we respond." Albright knew the truth. Jackson had them in a vice. If they refused, he wouldn't just take his business elsewhere. He would become an active, vocal, and devastatingly effective opponent of their airline. He would speak about the incident at conferences, in interviews, in private conversations with other corporate leaders. He would use his immense platform to paint Stellara Air as a haven for prejudice, a relic of a bygone era. The reputational damage would be incalculable, dwarfing the cost of his demands. The board debated, argued, and ultimately capitulated. They had no choice. Marcus Jackson had leveraged their single ugly act of discrimination into a referendum on their entire corporate soul, and he had the power to make their failure a very public and very expensive one. The fallout for Claire Sterling was swift and brutal. She was fired, as were the two officers. Her union's appeal was a perfunctor failure. The evidence against her was too public and too damning. Stellara threw her to the wolves to save themselves. The career she had spent 2 decades building was annihilated in a single day. But the karma was more intricate than just losing her job. The story, now officially confirmed by the airline's graveling public apology, was everywhere. Her name and, in some corners of the internet, her photo were attached to the incident. She became the face of a certain kind of privileged racist entitlement. The airplane Karen of the week. She was evicted from her apartment in a desirable neighborhood. The landlord cited a clause about bringing the property into disrepute. Friends she had known for years, many of whom also worked for the airline, ghosted her. They couldn't afford to be associated with her toxicity. She tried to find work with other airlines, but she was radioactive. No one would touch her. The ultimate, most ironic twist came about a month later. Broke, humiliated, and desperate, Claire was forced to sell her car, her designer bags, the trappings of the life she had so carefully constructed. She had to move into a tiny, run-down apartment in a low-income neighborhood, the kind of place she would have sneered at just weeks before. To make ends meet, she took the only job she could get, working the night shift as a cleaner. Her new uniform was not a pristine Stellar Air suit, but a drab, ill-fitting janitorial jumpsuit. One evening, while scrubbing the floor of a large, gleaming office building in downtown Manhattan, she looked up at the directory in the lobby. And there it was, etched in chrome lettering at the very top. Logic, the office of the CEO, Marcus Jackson. She was cleaning the floors of the man whose children she had wronged, the man whose quiet, controlled fury had systematically dismantled her entire existence. She had judged 2 young girls based on their appearance and assumed they didn't belong in a world of privilege. Now she was the one on the outside, invisible, scrubbing the floors of that very world, a living ghost in the empire her victim's father had built. This was the hard karma. It wasn't just punishment. It was a perfectly constructed, soul-crushing irony. She had not just fallen from grace. She had landed in the very place her prejudice had reserved for others. A year can feel like a lifetime, or it can pass in the blink of an eye. For those connected to the aborted journey of Stellara Air Flight 723, it was both. The incident itself became a fixed point in time, a wound in the timeline of their lives. But the healing or the festering was a slow daily process, a quiet evolution that took place long after the news cycle had moved on. The world saw a story of corporate comeuppance and satisfying karma. But the reality for those at its heart was far more complex, a landscape of subtle scars, hard-won wisdom, and the relentless grinding nature of consequence. For Maya and Nia, the initial aftermath was not a victory parade, but a quiet, suffocating trauma. The world celebrated their father's power, but they were left to grapple with their own powerlessness. That feeling of being singled out, of having their identity used as a weapon against them, of being physically overpowered while a crowd of adults watched in silent assent, did not simply vanish when the flight was cancelled. It lingered, a toxic residue in their minds. Maya, who had always found solace in the quiet order of books and logic, found her internal world besieged by chaos. In the weeks that followed, she was plagued by nightmares, not of the event itself, but of surreal, anxious scenarios, being lost in endless identical airport corridors, of showing tickets that turned to dust in her hands, of speaking but having no sound come out. She developed a physical aversion to crowded spaces. A trip to the mall would end in a sudden, inexplicable need to flee, her heart hammering against her ribs, the ambient chatter of the food court sounding like the accusatory whispers of the first-class cabin. Her father, Marcus, recognized the signs of trauma and arranged for therapy. But her most profound healing came from the late-night talks they began to have. These were not lectures, but raw, vulnerable conversations. One night, finding her staring out her bedroom window, unable to sleep, he sat beside her. "You're still there, aren't you?" he asked softly. "On the plane." She nodded, tears welling. "I just keep seeing their faces, Dad." The woman with the pearls. She looked right at me, and then just looked away like I was nothing, like I wasn't even worth a word. Marcus didn't offer platitudes. He offered a piece of himself. When I was 25, he began, his voice low. I was the only black engineer in my division at my first tech job. I designed a piece of code that solved a major bug. At the presentation, my boss presented it as his own work. He stood at the front of the room using my slides, explaining my logic. I sat in the back just like everyone else. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up and call him a thief. But I knew if I did, I wouldn't be the hero. I'd be the angry black man. I'd be the one causing a disturbance. So I stayed silent. And that night, I went home and felt a shame so deep it was like I was choking on it. The shame of not speaking up. Maya looked at him, seeing not the untouchable CEO, but a man who had felt the same sting she had. "So what did you do?" she whispered. "I stayed," he said, "and I worked twice as hard. I made myself so valuable, so undeniably brilliant that they couldn't ignore me. I documented everything. I built alliances. And a year later, when that same boss tried to take credit for another one of my projects, I didn't have to scream. I just presented my own data, my own documentation, to his superiors. I didn't get angry. I got even, and I did it within the system they built. I used their rules against them. That Maya is what we did to Stellara Air. Your silence on that plane wasn't weakness. It was you gathering your strength. Your call to me was you presenting your data. Nia's trauma manifested differently. The budding architect who once saw the world as a series of beautiful structures to be admired and drawn, now saw its hidden weaknesses, its hostile designs. Her sketchbook, once filled with graceful, soaring lines, became crowded with dark, defensive images. She drew buildings that looked like fortresses with high walls, few windows, and sharp, angular lines. Her art became an expression of her newfound distrust of the world. She, the more gregarious twin, grew quiet and watchful. At school, she'd sit at the back of the classroom, observing her peers, wondering which of them would look away if she were in trouble. The experience had taught her a brutal lesson in social physics. Bystander apathy was a force as powerful as gravity. Her turning point came not from a talk, but from an action. Months later, Marcus took the twins to the opening of the first community youth center, funded by the Stellara Endowment. It was in a part of the city they rarely visited, a vibrant neighborhood starved of resources. As they walked in, They saw dozens of black and brown kids using brand new computers, playing chess and working with tutors in a bright, beautifully designed space. Nia watched a young girl, no older than 10, sketching at a table, her face a mask of concentration. The girl was drawing a picture of a house, and it wasn't a fortress. It was open with a big door, lots of windows, and smoke curling happily from the chimney. In that moment, something inside Nia shifted. She saw that her father's response hadn't just been about punishment. It was about construction. It was about building something new and hopeful from the wreckage of something ugly. That evening, she opened her sketchbook to a fresh page. She began to draw a new kind of building. It was a library, but it was circular with glass walls so that everyone inside could see out, and everyone outside could see in. There were no dark corners, no hidden places. It was a design built on the principle of transparency, of safety through community. She had found her new architectural language. She wouldn't design fortresses to keep the world out. She would design spaces that dared the world to be better. Maya found her voice in the formal arena of the high school debate team, where her first chosen topic was implicit bias as a threat to public safety. Her hands shook as she approached the podium, but her voice when it came was clear and strong, resonating with the authority of lived experience. The twins had integrated their trauma. It was now a part of their DNA, a source of profound strength and a shared, unwavering purpose. Inside the glass towers of Stellara Air, the Jackson Mandate, as it was bitterly nicknamed by some, was a corporate earthquake. The company-wide bias training, designed by a top DEI firm, was relentless and uncomfortable. Robert Albright insisted on attending one of the first sessions for flight crews himself. He sat in the back, listening as a facilitator walked his employees through scenarios that were chillingly familiar. He watched as veteran flight attendants, people who had worked with Claire Sterling for years, bristled at the suggestions. "We have 100 things to do before takeoff," one complained. "We don't have time to psychoanalyze every passenger." "It's not about psychoanalysis," the facilitator countered calmly. "It's about pausing before you act. It's about asking yourself, is my response based on this person's behavior or on a story I'm telling myself about this person?" The change was not instantaneous. It was a slow, painful grind. But Albright, humbled and genuinely changed by the ordeal, pushed it relentlessly. He knew his legacy, and the airline survival depended on it. The real proof of change came 6 months later. An internal report landed on his desk about a flight from Atlanta. A young black man, a famous musician traveling incognito in a hoodie, and jeans had been seated in first class. A new flight attendant, trained under the new program, had felt a flicker of the old suspicion. But she paused. She checked her manifest. She saw the name, and instead of questioning his presence, she walked up to him and said, "Mr. Davies, welcome aboard. I'm a huge fan of your last album. Can I get you anything before we take off?" The musician, who had been bracing for a confrontation, was so taken aback that he later tweeted about it, calling Stellara Air classy and the only way to fly. That single tweet, Albright knew, was worth more than 100 press releases. He had a long way to go, but the ship was slowly turning. For Claire Sterling, there was no ship to turn. There was only the endless grey ocean of her new reality. Her life became a series of descending circles of humiliation. The job as a night cleaner at the Logic Building was the final crushing irony, a karmic punchline delivered with brutal precision. Her days were inverted. She slept when the world was awake and worked when it was asleep. A ghost haunting the spaces of power she once navigated with ease. The hardest part of the job was the silence. It gave her too much time to think, to replay the scene on Flight 723 over and over. She'd be wiping down a boardroom table and would suddenly see the face of Nia, the defiance hardening in her eyes. She'd be polishing the glass of a skyscraper window and see the reflection of the woman she used to be, confident, respected, immaculate. Now all she saw was a tired woman in a cheap grey jumpsuit, her hair tied back in a messy bun, her hands raw from chemical cleansers. She never felt pure remorse. It was a feeling too complex for her to grasp. What she felt was a profound, bottomless well of self-pity, curdled with a bitter resentment. She resented the twins for being there, for not being who she thought they were. She resented Marcus Jackson for his immense, unassailable power. She resented her colleagues for abandoning her and the passengers for turning on her. In her mind, she was the victim, a woman whose life had been ruined over a simple mistake. The final turn of the screw came during the holiday season. The Logic lobby was decorated with a massive digital display that cycled through holiday greetings and company highlights. One evening, as Claire was emptying the trash cans, a new image appeared. It was a photo of the Jackson family, Marcus, his wife, and the twins standing in front of the new youth center. They were smiling, surrounded by happy children. Underneath the caption read, "The Jackson family and the Logicor Foundation, building a brighter future together." Claire froze, her hand clutching a half-empty bag of trash. She stared at their faces, radiant with purpose. They were builders. They were creating something. And she was the one who cleaned up what others left behind. She had tried to put them in their place, and in doing so, had been consigned to this one, an invisible janitor, forever polishing the image of the family she had wronged. A living testament to the fact that karma isn't always a lightning bolt. Sometimes it is simply the soul-crushing weight of a life you never wanted, earned by your own choices. She turned away from the screen, picked up her cart, and pushed it into the echoing darkness of the empty hallway. There was more work to be done. So what's the takeaway from this? It's a stark reminder that in 2025, prejudice can still wear a professional uniform and a polite smile. Maya and Noah's story is a testament to the quiet dignity and immense strength it takes to stand up to injustice, even when you're outnumbered and publicly shamed. But it's also a story of powerful, righteous consequence. It shows that when you have a platform, you have a responsibility, and Marcus Jackson used his not just for revenge, but for systemic reform, turning a painful lesson for his daughters into a powerful legacy for countless others. This wasn't just about a cancelled flight, it was about the bill of prejudice finally coming due. If this story moved you, if you believe that dignity isn't a luxury item, then please hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more true life stories of drama, justice, and karma.